In 1979, 257 people boarded a sightseeing flight to Antarctica. None of them came back. The plane flew straight into a volcano that nobody could see. But the real scandal was not the crash. It was what the airline did after. One investigator called it an orchestrated litany of lies. It took 40 years for the government to finally apologize. And still today, no commercial airline flies a regular route over Antarctica. Not because of a treaty, not because of a conspiracy. The real reason is something most people never think about. On the morning of November 28, 1979, Air New Zealand flight TE901 lifted off from Auckland at 8:30 a.m. It was a McDonnell Douglas DC-1030 with registration ZKNZP, and it carried 237 passengers and 20 crew. The plan sounded almost unreal in the best way. An 11-hour sightseeing loop to Antarctica and back, a long day in the sky meant for wide windows, cameras, and once-in-a-lifetime views. Captain Jim Collins was in command. He was 45 years old and had 11,151 flight hours. Yet he had never flown the Antarctic route before. First Officer Greg Casson, 37, had not flown it either. In fact, none of the crew had, except flight engineer Gordon Brooks, who had done the trip once. And among the passengers sat a familiar name in New Zealand adventure history, Peter Mulgrew, Sir Edmund Hillary's longtime climbing companion. Mulgrew was on board as the Antarctic guide, the person who would help make the white world outside feel like a real place with real names. Hillary himself had been scheduled to go, but he canceled. Everything looked normal from the outside. That is what makes what happened next so hard to accept. Unknown to Collins and Casson, the coordinates loaded into the aircraft's navigation system had been changed just 14 hours before departure. For 14 months, a typing error had sent previous Antarctic sightseeing flights down McMurdo Sound, safely over flat sea ice, because the waypoint sat 27 nautical miles west of where it was supposed to be. The night before Flight 901, Captain Leslie Simpson noticed a mismatch and reported it. Air New Zealand's navigation section then corrected the coordinates, shifting the route from 70 Sahavidig 53 12 160 40 48 E to 70 70 52 106 33 On paper, it looked like a fix, but in the real world, it pointed the aircraft straight toward the 3,720 yard 4-meter slopes of Mount Erebus, an active volcano on Ross Island. The cruel part was how quietly the change slipped into place. The crew prepared their maps and planning using the old briefing materials. Nobody told them the path had changed, so they began the flight believing the aircraft would be tracking over safe terrain, the way the briefings suggested, with the scenery laid out like a guided tour. Hours later, as the plane approached Antarctica, the mood on board would have felt different. The sky was bright. The horizon was huge. People were taking pictures, leaning toward windows, looking for the shapes they had only seen in books. Then, at about 12:49 p.m. New Zealand Standard Time, the aircraft descended to around 1,500 feet for sightseeing. From the cockpit, it did not look like a dangerous move. It looked like they were lowering for a better view, exactly what the flight was built for. But the world outside was playing a trick that the human eye can fall for, even when everything else feels clear. A phenomenon called sector whiteout was in effect. A low overcast layer blended so smoothly with the snow-covered volcano that Mount Erebus disappeared into the background. It created the illusion of flat terrain stretching all the way to the horizon, like a clean white floor. Passenger photographs taken seconds before impact show that visibility in other directions was good, with landmarks visible 21 kilometers away. Yet the mountain itself had vanished right where it mattered most. Then, the warnings hit like a slap. The ground proximity warning system sounded its alarm. The urgent, "Whoop, whoop, pull up!" In the cockpit, Gordon Brooks called out, 500 feet, then 400 feet. Collins ordered go around power, and still there was not enough time. Only 6 seconds passed between the first warning and the moment the DC-10, moving at full cruising speed, struck the lower slopes of Erebus at 447 meters elevation, all 257 people died instantly. After the impact, the story did not settle into peace. It split, and it stayed split for years. The first major investigation came from Chief Inspector of Air Accidents Ron Chippendale, and he blamed pilot error. His view was that Collins had descended below the minimum safe altitude without proper visual references. The public reaction was fierce. For many people, the idea that the crew simply made a careless choice did not fit the facts, and it did not fit what they believed about the men who died. So the government appointed Justice Peter Thomas Mann to lead a royal commission, announced on April 21, 1980. Over 75 sitting days, 52 witnesses, and 3,000 pages of evidence, Mahon went through the case piece by piece. He did not accept the simple pilot error story. He concluded that the single dominant and effective cause was the coordinate change by airline officials who programmed the aircraft to fly directly at Mount Erebus and did not tell the air crew. And when he delivered his final words, he used a line that would echo through New Zealand for decades. He said he was compelled to conclude that the false evidence he heard was not mistake or faulty recollection, but part of a planned deception, and he described it as an orchestrated litany of lies. The airline's leadership pushed back fast. Air New Zealand CEO Maury Davis rejected Mahon's findings within hours, and the airline launched a legal challenge. The Court of Appeal sided with the airline on procedural grounds, saying Mahon had breached natural justice by not allowing the accused to respond properly. Mahon resigned from the bench in January 1982. He died of heart failure on August 11, 1986, at age 62. And even then, the argument did not fully end. It took until November 28, 2019, exactly 40 years after the crash, for Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern to deliver a formal government apology confirming that the pilots were not responsible for the tragedy. While the legal fight and public debate carried on, there was another reality on the ice that people rarely picture clearly. The recovery operation was called Operation Overdue, and it lasted 12 days. Up to 60 workers at a time struggled on the volcanic slope in gale force winds and minus 40°C wind chills. Their polar clothing became soaked in what lead investigator Inspector Jim Morgan described as black human grease from burned remains. Skua gulls attacked bodies in front of the teams. And even after all that effort, the loss stayed incomplete. Of the 257 dead, 44 were never individually identified, and 28 bodies were never recovered at all. Erebus was the most famous Antarctic aviation disaster, but it was not the first, and it would not be the last. Decades earlier, on December 30, 1946, during Operation High Jump, a Martin PBM-5 Mariner flying boat known as George 1 struck terrain near Thurston Island during an ice blink whiteout. 3 crew died. 6 survived, including pilot Ralph "Frenchie" LeBlanc, who lost both legs. Those survivors endured 13 days in brutal conditions before rescue. The dead comrades remain buried at the crash site to this day, and planned recovery missions between 2008 and 2012 were all canceled. Antarctica kept collecting stories like this, as if the continent demanded a price each time people tried to treat it like any other place. The U.S. Navy's Antarctic Development Squadron 6, known as VXE-6, operated from 1955 to 1999 and lost 7 personnel in aviation accidents across several incidents. One of them was a helicopter crash near Cape Royds in October 1992, also in whiteout conditions, that killed 3. There were moments of pure luck too, the kind that almost feels impossible. On October 8, 1970, a C-121J super constellation nicknamed Pegasus carried 80 people and crashed on the McMurdo ice shelf after 5 failed landing attempts in blizzard conditions. Somehow, every single person survived. The aircraft remains buried under ice, and the runway was renamed Pegasus Field in its honor. A reminder that even in a place that can swallow you whole, sometimes it lets you go. And the danger did not stay in the past. On December 9, 2019, a Chilean Air Force C-130H Hercules carrying 38 people vanished over the Drake Passage while flying to King George Island. A massive international search followed, with 23 aircraft and 12 ships from 6 nations, but only scattered debris was recovered from waters about 4,000 meters deep. The investigation was closed without a determined cause, with the Chilean Air Force pointing to the small amount of material retrieved from the sea. Even when a plane is found, Antarctica can still refuse to give people closure. On January 23, 2013, a Ken Borak Air Twin Otter crashed into Mount Elizabeth at 3,900 meters in the Transantarctic Mountains, killing all 3 Canadian crew members. The emergency transmitter activated, so the crash was not a mystery in the usual way, but winds of 170 km/h and thick cloud blocked rescue for 3 days. In the end, the crew's remains could not be safely recovered and were left at the crash site. A lot of people still believe that international law bans flights over Antarctica, and that idea spreads because it sounds dramatic and simple. But it is not true. The Antarctic Treaty from 1959 does not forbid aviation at all. In fact, Article 7 allows aerial observation at any time over any part of the continent. So the real story is not a legal wall. It is a wall made of rules, risk, and logistics that are so demanding that normal commercial flying becomes almost impossible. The biggest piece of that wall is something called ETOPS. It used to be known as Extended Range Twin Engine Operational Performance Standards, and in 2007 it was redefined as Extended Operations. In U.S. rules, it sits inside 14 CFR 161.161, and the idea is straightforward even if the details get heavy. A passenger aircraft cannot wander too far from an adequate diversion airport, because if something goes wrong, you need a safe place to land within a set amount of time. Since 2007, this logic is not only for twin-engine jets, it applies to all passenger aircraft, even the big 4-engine ones, whenever the route pushes beyond 180 minutes from a suitable alternate. On paper, modern planes can earn very high approvals. The highest rating currently held is ETOPS 370, which is 6.2 hours, and it belongs to the Airbus A350-900. Aviation outlets like Simple Flying note that this range covers almost the entire globe, with one stubborn exception that keeps showing up: a small part of Antarctica. And here is the catch that changes everything. Antarctica has 0 airports that qualify as adequate ETOPS alternates under FAA definitions. Yes, there are runways, but they are not the kind airlines can lean on for a passenger diversion plan. Many are compacted snow, blue ice, or short gravel strips. They often lack certification, lighting, emergency services, and year-round reliability. That is what turns a route from difficult into not happening, because ETOPS does not care how heroic the pilots are. It cares whether the backup plan is real. Once you move into polar flying rules, the demands tighten again. The FAA's Advisory Circular 120-42B talks about polar operations, and in Chapter 6, it makes clear that operating south of 60 degrees south is not something you do casually. An airline needs authorization that spells out designated diversion airports, a passenger recovery plan, and crew training built for polar conditions. It also expects planning for radiation exposure during solar flares, monitoring fuel freeze risk, and even carrying 2 cold weather anti-exposure suits for the crew. Then come validation flights that the FAA can observe. Even if you somehow solved the airport problem, you still have to prove you can handle the environment, recover people if you divert, and keep the operation safe when everything around you is trying to break your plan. Antarctica's airspace also sits in an unusual place, because no country has recognized sovereignty over the continent. That means no nation controls the airspace in the normal way you would expect elsewhere. Large parts of the continent are uncontrolled Class G airspace. The U.S. runs MAC Center at McMurdo and provides air traffic control, but compliance is mandatory only for U.S. Antarctic Program aircraft. while others are mainly encouraged to respect established categories. That legal gray zone sounds like freedom at first, until you realize it also means fewer services, fewer systems, and fewer safety nets. It is open sky, but it is lonely sky. Now, there is a loophole that often confuses people. Private jets operating under FAA Part 91 are technically exempt from ETOPS requirements entirely, which means they can fly places airlines cannot. Europe does it differently, and EASA subjects European private operators to a 120-minute rule. Still, this is why you do see private aircraft making the trip. Companies like White Desert and Adventure Network International regularly fly private planes to Antarctica's blue ice runways. So, flights do happen, just not in the everyday commercial way people imagine when they picture a normal airline route on a map. Even if you ignore the legal and regulatory load, the technical problems start stacking up fast, and they do not stack politely. Fuel is a perfect example, because it sounds simple until it is not. Standard Jet A has a maximum freezing point around -40°C, and Jet A1 freezes around -47°C. Over Antarctica's interior, the outside air temperature at cruising altitude can sit in the range of -65 to -74°C, and in winter, the stratosphere can sometimes drop below -80. Modern aircraft can warm fuel using heat exchangers tied to engine oil, but the danger is not only the fuel turning into a solid block. The uglier risk is water dissolved in the fuel, crystallizing into ice, then clogging filters and heat exchangers. That is not a fantasy problem. British Airways Flight 38 showed how real it can get on January 17, 2008, when both engines lost power at about 720 feet on approach to Heathrow, even though the fuel temperature never fell below -34°C. The investigation found ice crystals could build up and then restrict fuel flow, and that these crystals are especially sticky, around -12°C. They lodged in the many tiny tubes inside the fuel oil heat exchanger, and suddenly, a normal landing became a near disaster. When you place that kind of mechanism into a place as cold as Antarctica, you begin to see why planners get nervous long before wheels ever leave the runway. Then, navigation starts playing tricks that feel like a bad joke. The South Magnetic Pole sits far from the geographic South Pole, around 64 degrees south and 136 degrees east, and it drifts roughly 10 to 15 kilometers every year. Near it, Earth's magnetic field lines become nearly vertical. That makes compass needles drag, stick, spin, or even point down instead of giving clean direction. On top of that, magnetic declination can change rapidly over short distances, and at some points between the poles it can reach 180 degrees, which means a compass can point exactly the wrong way. Around Ross Island, near McMurdo, iron-rich volcanic rock adds localized anomalies that can make compasses basically useless. So pilots lean on grid navigation instead, using a constant grid north aligned with the prime meridian, rather than trusting magnetic or even true north the way they would elsewhere. People often assume GPS fixes everything, but even GPS gets weird at the ends of the Earth. GPS satellites orbit at about 55 degrees inclination, so no satellite passes directly overhead above 55 degrees latitude. At the poles, the best you get is satellites low in the sky, with maximum elevation around 45 degrees above the horizon, and that can degrade vertical accuracy. Systems like WS and EGNOS rely on geostationary satellites, and those are effectively unavailable above about 70 degrees latitude. Inertial navigation systems run into their own math problem at the poles because longitude changes infinitely fast with tiny east-west movement. So special approaches like wander azimuth or Earth-centered mechanizations are needed to keep the calculations stable. Communication is another quiet problem that becomes huge when you actually need help. There is no air traffic control radar anywhere in Antarctica. Geostationary communication satellites struggle near the poles and cannot function reliably poleward of roughly 80 degrees latitude, and signal quality can get rough above 70 degrees south. The satellite phone system known for dependable polar coverage is Iridium, built with 66 satellites in near-polar orbits at about 86.4 degrees inclination. HF radio can serve as a long-range backup, but solar storms can trigger polar cap absorption events that black out frequencies entirely. So even your backup can disappear right when you want it most. And then there is the weather, which is the part that does not care how well you planned. Antarctica produces the strongest katabatic winds on Earth, driven by dense cold air rushing downhill from the 3,000-meter polar plateau. The highest recorded wind speed on the continent is 327 kilometers per hour at Dumont d'Urville Station. Cape Denison is famous for extreme wind too, holding a record for the highest sustained average wind on Earth at 72 kilometers per hour over 2 years of measurement. These winds can jump from calm to violent, with almost no warning, throwing snow into the air and turning visibility into a blank wall. Imagine a commercial plane going down in the middle of Antarctica, far from the coast and far from any station. In that moment, survival turns into a problem where every option feels terrible because the place is built to punish mistakes. Even in summer, even when the sun is up, the interior is still brutally cold. If the crash happened near McMurdo Station during the summer season, there is at least a chance that helicopters could reach the site within 12 to 24 hours, but only if the weather stays calm enough to fly. That is the best case, and it is still a long time to sit in the cold with injuries, smoke, darkness inside the wreck, and the fear that help might not find you fast enough. Now, pull that same crash deeper into the interior, 700 kilometers or more from any station, and the timeline stretches. Rescue might take 2 to 5 days, and that is still assuming things go well. Planes and helicopters do not move freely there like they do in normal countries. They are chained to visibility, wind, fuel, and the simple fact that there are no nearby airports to divert to if conditions turn ugly. Antarctica does not forgive delays, and it creates them constantly. Winter is where the story turns frightening in a different way, because winter is not just colder. It is darker, it is quieter, it is more isolated. In winter, a rescue timeline can stretch to 1 to 2 weeks at minimum. The reason is not drama, it is machinery and physics. The only aircraft capable of operating in the darkness of Antarctic winter at temperatures below -60 degrees Celsius is the de Havilland Twin Otter, flown by Canada's Ken Borak Air out of their home base in Calgary. That is not a short hop. That is a chain of planning, staging, fuel, and timing, and every link can break. There is a real example that shows what those words mean. In 2016, there was a midwinter medical evacuation from the South Pole for 2 Lockheed Martin workers who were critically ill. The Twin Otters had to stage through Colombia, then Chile, then Rotorua, and the whole effort took about 8 days from launch to the patients arriving in Chile. That was not a mass disaster with dozens of injured people. That was 2 patients, and it still took more than a week because Antarctica in winter does not care how urgent your emergency is. So if passengers were sitting out there in airline clothing, with thin layers meant for a cabin, their clock would start running immediately. In summer interior conditions around -30 degrees Celsius, catastrophic hypothermia could hit within 15 to 30 minutes, especially if wind is cutting through wet fabric and exposed skin. In winter conditions at -60 degrees and below, that window shrinks to about 5 to 10 minutes. It is not about toughness. It is about the body losing heat faster than it can make it, and that happens fast when the air is that cold and the wind is scraping warmth off you like a blade. Even if help could reach the area, Antarctica is not set up for a big event with many injured people. There is no real mass casualty response capability on the continent. McMurdo's clinic cannot handle more than a handful of trauma cases, and there is no formal international agreement that governs land-based mass casualty incidents there. That gap matters because in most places on Earth, a disaster triggers systems. In Antarctica, the system is smaller, thinner, and stretched across a continent that does not want you there. Then there is the cost, which sounds unbelievable until you understand what the rescue actually involves. A single-person evacuation can run $100,000 or more. In winter, a complex operation can likely exceed $500,000. That is why Antarctic tour operators require medical evacuation insurance, often between $150,000 and $750,000 before they even let you travel. It is not a greedy rule. It is a survival rule because when something goes wrong down there, money turns into fuel, aircraft hours, crew time, and the ability to keep trying when the weather forces you to turn back. And the weather does force that often. The U.S. Antarctic program runs C-17 flights from Christchurch to McMurdo, and those flights operate with a formally calculated point of safe return. That is the last moment pilots can choose to turn around instead of committing to a landing where there is no alternate airport anywhere. People call these turnarounds boomerangs, and they are routine. A plane can get close, conditions can shift, and the smartest move is to return the way you came because Antarctica offers no backup plan once you cross the line. All of this makes it easy to assume that almost nobody flies there. But that is not true, and the reality is actually busy and surprisingly organized. Antarctica sees significant aviation activity every season, just not in the way most people imagine. The U.S. Antarctic program alone uses C-17 Globemasters and LC-130 Skybird Hercules from Christchurch to McMurdo, and they manage roughly 2,500 fixed-wing operations and about 11,000 helicopter sorties per season. Australia flies an Airbus A319 to Wilkins Aerodrome. Chile operates Teniente Marsh Airport on King George Island, which is Antarctica's only facility with an IATA code, TNM, and it handles over 200 flights per season on its gravel runway. Private operators are in the mix too, and they have their own routes and runways carved out of ice. Antarctic Logistics and Expeditions flies Ilyushin IL-76 cargo jets and Boeing 757s from Punta Arenas to Union Glacier's Blue Ice Runway. In November 2021, a high-fly Airbus A340 made the first-ever A340 landing on Antarctic ice at Wolf's Fang Runway. That detail matters because it shows how far aviation has pushed into a place that still feels unreachable. And then there is one of the strangest and most fascinating forms of Antarctic flying, flights that go there and never land. Qantas has operated Antarctic sightseeing overflights for 30 years, since resuming them on New Year's Eve 1994. They were organized by Melbourne travel entrepreneur Phil Asker of Croydon Travel, now known as Antarctica Flights. Today, they use Boeing 787-9 Dreamliners. These trips last about 12.5 to 14 hours. They depart from Australian cities, spend 3 to 4 hours over the continent, and return home without touching down. Roughly 7 flights operate per season, with prices ranging from AU199 to AU6499. Since the restart, more than 150 flights have carried tens of thousands of passengers. Air New Zealand, on the other hand, never resumed these flights, and that absence often gets noticed. Here is the part that confuses people even more. No regularly scheduled commercial route crosses the Antarctic continent itself, even though some flights come close. Qantas QF63 and QF64 between Sydney and Johannesburg sometimes reach 71 degrees south latitude. And on July 14, 2023, Qantas flight QF28 from Santiago to Sydney rerouted to 74.17 degrees south, which became the southernmost point ever reached by a scheduled commercial flight, and it did that to avoid headwinds. That fact sounds wild, but it also explains the rule. Flights can edge down there when the winds make it useful, yet airlines still do not build regular routes across the continent. The reason is not a secret rule and not some dramatic restriction. It is demand, and demand is geography. Only about 10 to 12% of the world's population lives in the southern hemisphere, and the city pairs that might benefit from trans-Antarctic routing, like Auckland to Cape Town or Perth to Buenos Aires, do not generate enough traffic to make it worth building a system around them. That is very different from the Arctic, where overflights connect North America to East Asia, one of the busiest corridors in aviation, and where there are many certified diversion airports across Greenland, Iceland, Canada, Alaska, and Scandinavia. Antarctica does not have those safety nets, so even if you could draw a shorter line on a map, the line is not the route. The route has to be survivable when something goes wrong. Still, the lack of normal airline traffic has created a different kind of attention. Conspiracy theorists look at the empty skies and treat it like evidence, especially flat Earth proponents who claim Antarctica is an ice wall encircling a disc-shaped planet. They point to empty maps on Flight Radar 24 and say, "See, nothing flies there." But they ignore a basic technical detail. Flight Radar 24 relies heavily on ADS-B receivers, and those receivers simply do not exist across Antarctica in the way they do across populated continents. In their story, the Antarctic Treaty becomes a document of concealment instead of cooperation, because that is how conspiracies work. They turn absence into proof. Then something happened that should have closed the argument, at least for anyone willing to look. In December 2024, a Colorado pastor named Will Duffy organized an event called The Final Experiment. He flew 4 flat earthers and 4 globe earthers to Union Glacier Camp via an ALE charter. Out there, they witnessed the 24-hour midnight sun, a phenomenon that cannot work on a flat Earth model. After seeing it, participating flat earther Geran Campanella of the Geranism channel admitted his model was invalid. Yet the broader flat Earth community rejected the evidence anyway. And one Alabama pastor even claimed that Satan created a fireball to act as a false sun.